Hello there. I am glad you can make it today. We are in the book of Second Kings, starting in chapter 24, and this story also occurs at the end of Second Chronicles chapter 36. So what we've got going on here is that King Josiah has died. He's been killed in battle with the Egyptian army, and what happens after this is that we see that Judah ends up with four more kings, and things just do not go well for Judah from this point on. And in the first case, what we have is the Egyptians picking a guy to be the king. And then after about 3 months, they decide, no, he's not working out. So they take him back to Egypt and put him in prison there. And then his brother becomes the king. And the Egyptians have something that they do that other kingdoms do, where when they want to show that they're the ones who are actually in charge, they pick who the king is going to be and change his name. We find out that later the Babylonians do the same thing. So very common back then. It's to let people know who really is the boss there. And now Judah is really living on borrowed time. Um, Even though they are considered a vassal state of Egypt, the Egyptians don't really think of them as being theirs. They just look to Judah as being something where they can get silver and gold and whatever else they want. And Judah has to give it to them if they want to kind of run things themselves. Well, they do that for a while, but meanwhile, Babylon has been growing in power. They eventually wipe out the Assyrians, take over, and they're headed back down into the area that was between Assyria and Egypt. The problem with that being that that's where Judah is. So here they come. They managed to drive the Egyptians off. Judah, which had been uh, under the control of Egypt, is now under the control of Babylon. They smartly switch over to them, and still what happens is Babylon comes in and says, okay, we're in charge now. And they take a bunch of stuff. And this is including a lot of the valuable things of gold and silver that were in the temple, as well as in the king's palace. They show that they're in charge, and they also take off a lot of the people that they want, ones who are important. Well, they have their own person in charge, and he rebels against them. And as they're coming back, then this particular king, Jehoiakim, surrenders. Actually, it turns out to be a brilliant move on his part, because there's no way they can hold out against Babylon. And none of these kings in here are in the business of following God. In fact, the Bible describes all of them as doing evil. So God's not going to help them out. Now, God has sent a lot of prophets at this time, and they are trying to tell the people and the leadership that, hey, you've got to turn toward God. But the people really aren't listening. Now, I'm not talking about absolutely every one of them, but so many of them have turned against God. And in reality, they had been like this for a long time, that uh, the ones who are good, who are trying to be good, realize that things just aren't working out. And a lot of them head to Egypt to get away from the Babylonians. Others, though, are there when the surrender takes place. Then more of the royal family and important people and well-to-do people, and even a lot of the soldiers, are taken off to Babylon. Now, this is probably the point at which Daniel and the guys we later know as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego get taken off to Babylon. And it includes also people like Ezekiel, who's going to become known as one of the major prophets. his book starts off during the exile when they are in Babylon. So what we're seeing is the dispersal of God's people. And what's going to happen is that as they are scattered all over the world, the ones who come back eventually tend to be the ones who believe in God and want to follow God. And those people will end up forming the core of the Jewish people in the world and the ones who will carry along the faith that God's looking for. But not to get ahead of myself on this, the Babylonians put Jehoiakim's uncle in charge, change his name, just like the Egyptians had done, and leave him there to take care of things. He rules for a while, but then after about 9 years, he decides that he can rebel against Babylon, and there may have been something to give him an idea that would work. At this point in time, meaning during those few hundred years, when an empire would grow, there would be times when it would be fighting somebody else and become weak, and then the little kingdoms that were being controlled by the empire might say, okay, this is a good time for us to rebel and we can be on our own again because they are dealing with bigger problems. Well, if that's what this Zedekiah was thinking, he was way wrong, because Nebuchadnezzar, who is leading the Babylonians, comes back. It takes a couple of years to take Jerusalem, but they do that. Zedekiah tries to get away. He's captured. He's taken to this place where he sees all of his family get killed in front of him. See, the Babylonians weren't playing around. If you put them to a lot of trouble, they were going to punish you. But they don't kill him. They do blind him and take him back to Babylon. And whereas Jehoiakim was taken to Babylon, but treated relatively well, with Zedekiah, that's not the case. And not only do the Babylonians take the city and the last remaining people who they saw as having value to their empire, they set fire to Jerusalem. They knock the walls down. During all of this, they have cleared out the last things of value from the temple and burn it down. And they burn down the king's palace and pretty much anything in the city that burns. They are leaving it to a few caretaker people to live in and produce crops, and that's about it. The few Jewish people left behind are extremely poor, and they are just there kind of occupying the space for Babylon whenever Babylon wants to send somebody there or do something in the area. So this is a terrible ending for the kingdoms and for Judah in particular, but we have to stop and think for a moment. Okay, God's people have been thrown out of the promised land. Well, it's exactly what he told his people would happen if they didn't follow him. So he's followed through on that. However, there's a remnant. Some of the prophets had been trying to tell the people all along that, okay, all of this bad stuff is going to happen, but God is going to reserve this land and bring his people home. Now, at this point, none of them can see the possibility of that ever happening. But the ones who actually trust God have that in the back of their minds, and they try to live day to day and prepare for the time when they will go back. So they are keeping up with important things like their traditions of praying toward Jerusalem and remembering the words, the teachings that God had given them, the things they would call the books of Moses. All of that, they're trying to hang on to that. And of course, that's the people who wanted to follow God. And what we are going to see in all of this is that eventually they will be allowed to go back and rebuild. But those are stories we have covered before, and you would be able to look up. The thing I want to leave with you for now is that behind all of this, there are things happening that should remind us of things that happen now. Is that the people cannot see what's going on. They just see that there are these rulers who are bad people, and they're fighting against other bad people. And what you have to remember is that behind all of that, you have Satan, who is trying to maneuver things against God and against God's will. We see something like this happening at the time where Jesus comes to earth much later on, and the devil is trying to do things to stop God's plan, but unwittingly, God's plan makes it through. Um, the devil cannot stop anything God has determined to do, no matter how he tries in all of this. And even though it looks like the devil is winning at times, as long as the people are still looking toward God for their hope and their future, God will be with them and be with them through all of the things that happen until his plan is fulfilled. So with that, I'm going to close this lesson with this remark with my tie. So I'm showing what we could think of as the devil. Well, we could also think of it as Nebuchadnezzar, or we could think of it as Pharaoh Necho. In any sense of it, there is great evil out there. And you could say it's the devil. You could say it's one of those leaders. But it can also be an ordinary people. And so no matter where the threat comes from, no matter what form the evil takes, we must be prepared for that and be prepared to stick it out and stay with God no matter what. All right, with that, I'm going to let you go, and I hope to see you in our other lessons. Thanks. Bye.